What if I told you that, more than 12,500 feet below the surface, there are first-class corridors aboard the Titanic where traces of luxury are still recognizable? With every sweep of light, door handles emerge, shattered porcelain, empty frames, crushed luggage, silent clues to how these cabins were used just hours before the ship vanished. But at one specific point, the camera slips through a narrow opening and enters a cabin that seems frozen in time until the light reaches something no one expects to find there. Before we move deeper into these cabins and uncover what truly remains preserved after 113 years, like the video and subscribe to follow this full exploration with us. In 1912, Titanic stood as the pinnacle of naval engineering and transatlantic luxury. After the sinking, the ship remained hidden for more than 7 decades, until it was found nearly 4 kilometers below the surface. Today, 113 years later, exploration is not about recovery, but about understanding how time, pressure, and the deep ocean reshaped its spaces, especially first class, the ultimate symbol of status on board. First class concentrated Titanic's most elaborate spaces, designed to mirror the comfort of Europe's finest hotels. Located near the ship's core, these areas are now scarred by collapse and flooding. By documenting them, researchers seek not only to understand the original luxury, but how internal architecture responded to sudden flooding, extreme pressure, and more than a century of relentless decay. As the ROV passes through these corridors, it enters the pathways that once organized first-class life. Water, sediment, and structural failure have turned them into an unstable maze. Every remaining object, a frame, a handle, a shard of porcelain, becomes an archaeological clue, helping reconstruct how these spaces functioned before the ship was lost. As the ROV advances, the corridors reveal how water moved through the ship's interior, redistributing objects and sediment. Decorative elements lost their original purpose and now mark flow, impact, and collapse. For maritime archaeology, the position of metal, ceramics, and fittings helps decode the dynamics of flooding and the pace of destruction within first class. Displaced personal belongings reveal the paths taken by rushing water. Suitcases, handles, and porcelain are no longer where they were left, but where the current carried them. Their distribution helps estimate flooding speed and zones of intense internal pressure. Each detail deepens our understanding of how first-class spaces were progressively transformed. As the ROV continues, clear signs of progressive collapse emerge. The weight of water and the loss of structural support caused ceilings to give way and corridors to deform. The arrangement of debris points to distinct phases of the sinking, allowing researchers to separate the initial impact from the slow, century-long process of degradation. Approaching the cabin areas, the interior becomes more compartmentalized. Doors, partitions, and recesses mark once private spaces, now distorted by flooding. Bed frames, handles, and small fittings help distinguish sleeping quarters from passageways, allowing researchers to reconstruct the daily layout of first class before collapse. Inside the cabins, the scale shifts. Smaller spaces concentrate objects and traces of daily use. Water entered through doors and walls, pushing furniture aside and depositing sediment unevenly. These environments offer some of the clearest evidence of first-class routines, and how abruptly they were interrupted by the sinking. As exploration moves between cabins, damage patterns become clearer. Some spaces flooded rapidly, while others collapsed later. Differences in furniture position and debris reveal uneven water movement. These contrasts help map the sequence of events unfolding inside first class during the final moments of the ship. As the ROV advances, damage intensifies and spaces grow increasingly unstable. First class reveals not just lost luxury, but clear evidence of rapid flooding and successive collapses. To follow how these corridors lead to even more sensitive discoveries, subscribe and continue this scientific journey into Titanic's most fragile interior spaces. Upon entering this cabin, the damage pattern changes abruptly. The tilted floor and partial wall collapse point to rapid flooding, followed by structural impact. Broken objects and twisted metal are not signs of abandonment, but of concentrated forces during the ship's final moments. From here on, every movement must account for instability. At this point, the arrangement of elements is no longer random. Floor inclination and sediment buildup indicate a sudden collapse, followed by slow settling on the ocean floor. Some shapes inside the cabin don't match known furniture or structures. Identifying what belongs and what doesn't is essential to interpreting what happened here. After documentation, protocol dictates retreat. Areas with advanced collapse carry a high risk of further failures and loss of visibility. For researchers, recording position and context is enough. The focus returns to structure. Understanding how internal forces shaped this space helps interpret other first-class sections yet to be explored. In this sector, collapse is not isolated but continuous. Deformed corridors, displaced furniture, and shattered reflective surfaces complicate spatial reading. Orientation now depends entirely on the ROV's instruments. These passages reveal how Titanic's interior became a fragmented environment, where each advance demands constant risk assessment. At this stage, navigation becomes a technical challenge. Fallen furniture, exposed beams, and corroded walls reduce visibility and restrict movement. Reflections from damaged surfaces distort depth perception, forcing the ROV to rely on instruments instead of visual cues. Progress is slow and deliberate, focused on documentation while minimizing disturbance to an already fragile structure. As the ROV proceeds, the ship's original geometry becomes unrecognizable. Shifted walls and collapsed partitions have completely altered orientation. Corroded surfaces scatter light unevenly, complicating depth perception. Navigation now relies less on sight and more on instruments, constant measurements, and extremely controlled movements. Here, Titanic's interior functions as a warped labyrinth. Corridors no longer follow original alignments, and the tight proximity of beams and walls demands constant measurement. The priority is documentation without contact. Any touch could stir sediment, destroy visibility, or trigger further collapse. At this point, disorientation is constant. Collapsed corridors erase visual references, while irregular surfaces make distance deceptive. Progress depends on precise readings, frequent pauses, and minimal adjustments. The mission remains unchanged. Document without interference, advancing only when stability allows. Here, movement occurs at the edge of operational limits. Successive collapses, loose sediment, and narrow passages raise the risk of entrapment and visibility loss. Every decision prioritizes environmental stability. Recording without contact becomes essential to preserving what still endures within first class. After passing the most unstable zones, the interior begins to open again. Reduced debris and shifting geometry signal the approach to a sector less affected by direct collapse. This transition is crucial. It shows destruction inside Titanic was uneven, and that some spaces resisted the sinking against all odds. Following areas of severe collapse, this cabin presents an unexpected contrast. The structure remains aligned, with objects still in functional positions. Differences in location, structural support, and load distribution explain why certain first-class spaces endured flooding and impact better than others. Comparisons with earlier areas help explain this preservation. This cabin sits in a zone with stronger structural support and reduced torsional stress during descent. Loads were distributed more evenly, limiting internal collapse. These factors make this space a key reference for understanding first-class resilience. This cabin becomes a benchmark for the entire exploration. Its preservation allows comparisons of materials, construction techniques, and usage patterns with collapsed areas. What once appeared as mere ruin now offers a clearer picture of how first class functioned before the sinking and why some spaces survived longer than others. Entering this suite marks a turning point. The space is larger and more elaborate, but structurally compromised. Ceilings have fallen, walls have eroded, and decorative elements collapsed under the combined weight of time and water. What once symbolized progress and power now reveals absolute fragility before the ocean. In this suite, scale delivers the final contrast. Designed to impress, it now exposes the limits of engineering in the deep sea. What once stood for status and innovation has become physical evidence of vulnerability. Here, Titanic is not just a wreck, it is a monument to human ambition, challenged by nature. With documentation complete, the ROV begins its withdrawal. First-class spaces return to deep silence, preserved by darkness and time. More than a century later, Titanic remains motionless on the Atlantic floor, holding stories that can be observed but never fully recovered.